Welcome to this week's edition of Next Steps Forward. I'm your host, Chris Meek. It's great to have you with us again today. Today's guest has had an extraordinary career as a public servant, corporate executive, and academician. He's a survivor in the truest sense of the word, having survived a horrific small plane crash that killed 5 people and severely injured his son and him. He's a former Secretary of the Navy and a former Administrator of NASA. He's with us for the entire podcast today. Sean OKeefe, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be with you.
I shared some of your bio, but for our listeners who may not know your entire background, Sean OKeefe is a 4-time presidential appointee, first as Comptroller and CFO at the Defense Department, then as a Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget and Deputy Assistant to the President. Next, as Secretary of the Navy from 1992 to 1993, and finally, as Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA to us simple folks, from 2001 to 2004. He was a company officer and vice president at GE, and then was chairman and CEO of Airbus Group, which is the American division of the world's second largest aerospace corporation, from 2009 to 2014. He has held faculty positions at Penn State and LSU. Today, he is a university professor in the Howard and Louise Fansteel Endowed Chair in Strategic Management and Leadership at my beloved alma mater, Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Mr. Secretary, there are so many things we could talk about during your illustrious public career. Your time at NASA provides so many lessons in leadership, integrity, empowerment. I feel we're going to spend most of our time there today, but let's just dive in, and you'll pardon my pun, please. Somewhere around the start. Your dad was a naval officer on a nuclear submarine and served under the father of the nuclear Navy, Admiral Hyman Rockover. How did growing up in that environment shape who you are and the professional path that you chose?
Well, it was a profound impact. My dad was a submarine engineering duty officer who was stationed on more of the industrial facilities around the Defense Department, the Navy Department in particular, and around Navy submarine operations bases, which usually had a pretty strong contingent of Marines there as well. So I got a very strong dose of the Navy and Marine culture growing up throughout the course of my life. So it was a extraordinary experience. And it was every couple of years we packed up and moved somewhere else, and it turned out to be a great adventure. And the only place that was common was my folks were both born and raised within a couple of blocks of each other in New Orleans, Louisiana. So that was home as far as I knew. We always passed through there. I think I was 25 before I realized that all roads did not have to go through New Orleans.
You started your career as a budget analyst after getting your MPA at Syracuse University, in the Department of Navy. I'm sorry, no, it's Loyola University, right? I apologize for that.
Undergrad at Loyola, yeah.
And I work in the financial services industry, and I still know people who run from the room in terror at the sight or thought of a spreadsheet. What did you like so much about numbers crunching that drew you to your career in that?
Well, it was a realization, much as I was not a particularly well-qualified financial expert by any means at all coming out of grad school. But what I realized in the course of that time was this was the one area in any organization, it doesn't matter, public, private, nonprofit, any kind of organization you can think of, that absolutely has an exposure of just about everything that organization does. And so your awareness and depth of understanding of the totality of what the outcome, the mission, the strategy, all those things are of the organization is best seen through the prism of that financial effort, because I've yet to run into any organization that says we don't need any resources at all. Don't worry, we're all set. Every one of them requires some aspect of that in terms of the full range of definitions of what constitutes resources. And the financial resources are certainly a major lever that works through that. Understanding decision process of how that gets determined from whatever organization it may be, that gives you a real good understanding of how decision making gets made, or at least is contributed to as you go through that process. And it's a very illuminating aspect of it, and one that I found in the earliest all the way up through the mid portion of my career as being a primary foundation of looking at the financial aspects of any organization.
So you start with the Department of Defense. You move to the Senate Appropriations Committee in the 1980s. And while you're there, you meet somebody our listeners may have known. You connect with a congressman from Wyoming named Dick Cheney.
Mhm.
Fast forward to George H.W. Bush's administration. Cheney is now Secretary of Defense. And he chooses you as the controller and CFO at the Defense Department. That had to be daunting. How do you prepare yourself for such a huge leap in responsibilities?
Well, one of the great aspects of spending nearly a decade on the Appropriations Committee staff was the privilege to work for and with Senator Ted Stevens, who was the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee during all of my tenure there, and ultimately I became his staff director on the committee, which provided a tremendous insight, interaction, constant coordination with the administration, with the Defense Department, with the National Security Team, across the full expanse of that decision process. And it sort of provided an awareness and depth of understanding of the national security agenda, and in turn, what the issues were. But inevitably, in the course of every appropriations year, this was the one piece of legislation throughout the Congress that always had to move. An appropriations bill at the time that I served there always had to be enacted, because failure to enact something meant that you were out of the capacity to actually obligate funds. So as a result, anything, every issue, every challenge, in addition to the financing issues, always got settled somehow as a result of that on an appropriation measure, whether it had policy implications or finance implications or whatever. And it was in the course of that I got to know then Congressman Cheney, knew his reputation from a legendary past that he had as chief of staff to White House to President Ford, and he was steeped in a depth of understanding of the entirety of the federal expanse. And it was in that kind of role that he was on the opposite side of the Capitol Hill from where I was, obviously. But always he was the point person who was a member who was assigned to come in with those policy issues that needed to be settled at the end. So I came to know him and his staff very well. And so as a result, I was not an unknown commodity when he ultimately became the Secretary of Defense and was looking for filling out his team, and invited me to be part of that. And I think that was in large measure because he knew Ted Stevens, and he knew the depth of his understanding and capacity to actually drive the national security agenda as well. So it was a good opportunity to really bring in someone with background in that particular area, but also in particular for me, it was a real extraordinary experience to work for a brilliant strategist in the form of Dick Cheney, who understood exactly the challenges we were confronting.
So after that, President Bush appoints you to serve as the 69th Secretary of the Navy. How big of an honor was that for you?
Well, it was an extraordinary privilege, no question about it. It was an amazing honor that the president would have that kind of confidence to appoint me in the capacity. But it was kind of a mixed blessing in the sense that the circumstances surrounding this was the resignation of my predecessor, and a lot of controversy at the Navy Department at the time over a really extensive issue that had lingered for the better part of a year. That was a really early precursor of the Me Too kind of movement, in which there really was a set of really outlandish demonstrations and acts of sexual harassment, as well as accusations of assault that had just lingered for the better end of a year. And so as a consequence, when my predecessor resigned, I was appointed as a consequence of the fact that I had been currently in a capacity of having been an appointed official at the Defense Department as the controller and CFO of the Defense Department. And having been in that role for over 3 years, the determination was, he's handy. We know where he lives, and he'll follow instructions well. And I like to think I didn't disappoint in that regard.
So dealing with that high profile scandal, What lessons did you learn there that would build on your experience and help you going forward?
I guess the first one is that anything that is a major disruption in any organization that really does occupy the attention, the focus, and the emotional capacity on the part of folks up and down the entirety of the organization that are certainly the ones that are affected most profoundly, but others who are in leadership roles, is that that is a major focus of what is going to be an external issue that needs to be addressed and that absolutely must be confronted. And it speaks to the culture of the organization. But there's also, the day in and day out challenges of managing an enterprise of that size. My first day in the job, I asked Secretary Cheney at that time, I said, "What's your guidance?" And he said, "Well, I've got two things for you." So the first one is know that you're now in charge of an organization of 1 million people across the globe, Navy, Marines, and civilians, engaged in all kinds of things in lots of different places, and know that at this moment, there is somebody doing something really stupid, and it will now be your responsibility to go figure out why and to explain it and deal with it. So best of luck with it. The second thing was mundane by comparison, but that would get my attention. It realized I was very clear understanding of the fact that you're there in a role in which you are, responsible for leading and managing through issues that are disruptive by nature, but at the same time, keeping everybody's eye on the ball of what the primary mission and focus is of the organization going forward, such that it doesn't consume everybody's attention going forward, and that there's enough trust and confidence that the leadership will deal with it. So that's a primary feature of that. The other part is to, in many ways, trust your instincts. There is a set of challenges that are going to emerge in these kind of situations that really do require an immediate kind of reaction to them. And you'll never have all the information you need in order to act in a way that is complete in that case. And so be sure that how you're acting to this is one that in turn is open enough to be informed by developments as they occur to continue to refine that decision. And that takes a little bit of a calibration of what is involved. And then again, from the instinct standpoint, it's a matter of just relying on the values and principles you learned getting to that stage. And know that there's an inviolate proposition of what cannot be passed, a line that can't be crossed, and always know where your true north is in making those kinds of decisions. And in those cases, you never have to look back and wonder whether you made the right decision, just whether or not you were true to yourself in doing it to the best of your ability going forward.
Next, you're appointed NASA administrator, where you were initially viewed as a bean counter rather than a space enthusiast and agency cheerleader. You were there to get control of the International Space Station's $4.8 billion cost overruns. For listeners who find themselves as an outsider coming in to fix a problem, you're usually not going to be welcomed with open arms. How should they approach the situation so they are as effective as possible?
Well, I guess this was not a new reaction. I had the same one going in and as a Navy secretary. Was an awful lot of folks just said, what are we doing now with this financial weenie who's coming in, who doesn't know anything about operating programs. And the reality is, which you step up and say, look, I don't know your job better than you do. I'm never going to pretend that I know your job better than you do. But instead, I want you to understand that I'm going to have absolute, complete confidence in you to perform in that regard, or we're going to have something we're going to need to deal with. And that was true at NASA as well. I mean, the approach that was taken there is I early on said, look, I have absolutely no notion whatsoever and no illusions that I could be the chief engineer, the chief scientist, the chief technologist, the best astronaut, none of that. None of those things I would ever be qualified to, or selected to do. But having an instinct and an understanding and a knowledge and experience of having brought together disparate communities to work together to an outcome is something I do know something about. And so in that regard, this is an opportunity where we've really got to deal with complex systems integration kinds of issues. And that is all about how you pull all the individual pieces together to make the sum of the parts substantially greater than any one of them would be. And everybody took a leap of faith on that for a while and understood it. But the immediate test of that was to deal with the overrun, because as soon as the new administration had come in, I was on the White House staff for the first year of the Bush administration in 2001 as the deputy director at OMB in that role, and it was very apparent that the nearly $5 billion overrun on a global collaborative program for which all the partners were contributing resources was one that was gaining the attention of the Secretary of State, the President himself, as a consequence of heads of state and foreign ministers coming in and saying, why am I receiving a bill for an overrun? I thought this was something we had agreed to how this would be handled. And so this was a circumstance where the president's view was this is a management problem. And so therefore I'm going to put a financial manager, someone who has a background in the whole field, into the job to run the agency. That gave me a rather significant standing, I guess, by virtue of that his articulation of precisely what the objective was, and an immediate burning platform that everybody knew had to be addressed, and working that through not just as a financial issue, but as one that was, again, complex systems engineering challenge, and coordinating this with 18 different nation states who were all part of the same enterprise to agree to what a configuration would look like that we were prepared to support and to finance.
You had a number of challenges at NASA, but without a doubt, the most difficult one came on the morning of February 1st, 2003, the tragic loss of Space Shuttle Columbia. We spent a lot of time talking about numbers and leadership, but let's talk about the importance of care and compassion for others. In the fleeting minutes between your realizing that Columbia had been lost and others beginning to comprehend that, you acted swiftly to spare the flight crew's family from the same glaring spotlight that the Challenger crew's families endured when it exploded before their eyes in 1986. It's difficult sometimes to know how or if to show compassion for others in the workplace, especially these days. How do you recognize when to act, or even how to act in moments large and small like that?
Well, it's the events that day are ones that are seared in my memory forever. It was had been at the agency for not quite a year and a half at that point. We'd worked our way through the previous program management challenge that I mentioned here before with the International Space Station. And on that day, we were really pretty buoyant because it was the opening chapter of where we were going with really a revised agenda and a focus and a concentration of now righting the ship and moving forward. And it was a historic mission in that, among the 7 remarkable people who were members of the crew, one of which, Ivan Ramon, was the first Israeli astronaut. So the world's attention was on this event. And so that morning, having gotten to know the families of all the crew members in the time well before that, I was there for the launch of Columbia 2 weeks earlier of the mission itself, and had gotten to know everybody very well by that stage. So we were all together again in Florida, anxiously awaiting and very upbeat about what was a very, very successful mission over that previous 2 weeks. It was due to return that morning of the 1st of February. And so standing there in the stands at the landing strip, if you will, of the Kennedy Space Center, waiting for the shuttle to return was a moment that went from absolute delight and anxious anticipation of seeing the successful crew members return with their families, and then kind of a pause in which we realized that nothing was happening. There was no, all the events that normally lead up to a landing didn't occur. And then a dawning realization that this was certainly a likely circumstance where catastrophe had struck. So I watched and worked with the families as they went from elation to complete despair in a span of minutes. Recognizing that, and among the lessons learned from the Challenger events all those years before, one of the things I learned was to really avoid having the families exposed to just the media interests and so forth of trying to calibrate their reaction and all that. And there were plenty of media there. Yes, this was a global event that was really attended and watched by many of the outlets. So the first move instinctively was to immediately evacuate the families, if you will, back to the crew quarters of the Kennedy Space Center so that they could have an opportunity to reflect on their own and just realize having was. And it was about a half an hour afterwards that I was able to speak to the president to apprise him of what we knew at the time, which was not a whole lot, but enough to know that Columbia was not returning, and we were starting to piece together all the observations made. And his very first question, as soon as I gave him the thumbnail sketch of where we were, he said, "Where are the families?" And that sent a message back to me powerfully that said, that ought to be your priority. It was at the first instance as a matter of instinct. It clearly was his. And so that ought to be the continuing focus that we think of all the time and with great regularity. So that shaped an awful lot. I mean, his instinct on this was quite good. He spoke to them himself about an hour or so later. I had a chance to mourn with them, to console them from the distance that he was, at that time. When he was in Washington on that day. But at the same time, they understood that he obviously emoted a level of compassion that was a clear best example that I could ever have hoped for in the course of that time. He made it a point on several occasions to include the very last funeral of the last of the 7 astronauts who were interred at Arlington National Cemetery, to have all the families to the White House. And he and the First Lady spent what the families thought was going to be a half an hour of conversation and really just kind of working with them to reconcile to where this was. 2 hours later, he was still, engaged with them, and I thought that's the power of example is a strong one. And George W. Bush and the First Lady were absolutely the best I could possibly have imagined to set that kind of example of how we all want to be. So it was being led well is one of the things you hope for in life, and I certainly was.
Mr. Secretary, one account I've read describes the Columbia disaster as having seared O'Keefe to the core, while noting that you handled the crisis with a rare blend of strength and compassion. It also said the incident opened a window of opportunity for change at NASA. How is it possible for moments of great tragedy or stress even to not only move forward, but to really move forward in a huge positive way?
Well, in any moment of extraordinary disruptive change in which the habits and behaviors and daily routine of all of us is altered, that presents a extraordinary moment in which everything is negotiable. There are a number of different factors that suddenly make folks very receptive to considering different ways of looking at things and alternatives and so forth. And it's just a matter of being very selective and understanding, first and foremost, what's the objective you're trying to achieve, where you're trying to go. In the post-Columbia environment, it became very evident after a multitude of very helpful congressional hearings, and I can imagine you can visualize what that helpfulness was, that nonetheless brought home the proposition that there was looming skepticism within the elected overseers of the people of the United States, that there was skepticism as to whether or not the agency was up for the kinds of challenges and exploration and risks that takes to pursue the very agenda of what started that legendary agency back in 1958. And in so many ways, that became a focal point, an opportunity to, again, first and foremost, remind everyone in the agency that our first responsibility ought to be to those who dedicated themselves to this extraordinary venture of exploration and lost their lives because of what we did or didn't do. And so getting through the investigation of that whole process, how that went wrong, understanding exactly where we failed to be as diligent in the process as we needed to be to assure those kinds of high risk kind of ventures going forward was a major objective as a testimonial, and at least in memory of those who gave their lives in the course of that, but also as a mechanism of reconciliation and closure to all the families whose lives were changed immediately upon that event. So that became the first thing. How do we restore, how do we reestablish and really set standards for what the safety culture of that agency had always been, at the same time that it was taking high risk ventures. It was able to balance both. And that's a real trick. It's a matter of fact, an amazing feat to try to figure out exactly how to do that properly that parses that risk determination relative to the objective overall, and yet at the same time not be deterred from taking those risks and going forward. Because after all, what an agency like NASA was always founded to do was to tackle things and issues and opportunities for which no one else had even tried, and much less been successful at. And so as a consequence, you're always going to be venturing into that which you don't know is going to hurt you if you're not careful. So that became a restoration of that focus, of being concentrated on that activity. But at the same time, there was also that opens up another window that says, and to what end? What is the objective? What are we trying to really accomplish with all this? And so let's be clear and straightforward, transparent in the minds of all of the professionals that are part of the agency, but also to everybody externally, the American people that are making this possible, that here are the reasons why we're doing these things. This is what the objective is. This is the focus we're after. And so it was an opportunity to affirm and very clearly establish what the mission and objective of the agency is all about, rather than a collection of 20,000 unbelievably talented, professional, and technically qualified, imaginative engineers, scientists, and technologists, all basically flying as if they were wild geese, accidentally flying in formation. No, the idea is to instead, focus on what is the specific objective that we're all after, and then we can all pick up an oar and make that happen because of that application of all those talents and skills that only this agency can do. And that became a focal point, and it became an opportunity to mobilize the culture of the workforce to be recognizing constantly that the risk that is being taken is higher than anything else that any other discipline or profession would normally do. And at the same time, we're doing things to great effect and to great end, and to achievement that once they are accomplished is really quite remarkable. It is in some of that, it made for an experience that I realized the highs were really high. When we won, when we were successful, it was extraordinary because it was the first time it had been done. And the lows were really low. When it went wrong, it went deadly wrong. And so trying to reconcile those two emotional standards that then captures itself into a very clear strategic mission objective of what you're after was the primary call. And the Columbia tragedy was a catalyst for exactly that kind of rediscovery.
Someone once joked that crises just seem to follow you. It was after your time in public service when you became the chancellor of Louisiana State University with an agenda to lead LSU back among the top-ranked schools in the country, only to be forced to respond to Hurricane Katrina. Thousands upon thousands of New Orleans residents sought refuge on the LSU campus because it was said to be the only functioning public institution within about a 200-mile radius. Your basketball arena was turned into a makeshift hospital so that about 35,000 people could be treated in the span of about 6 to 8 weeks. And yet, you accomplished your objectives and successfully handled that crisis. What is your process, or really your secret, if you will, for prioritizing objectives and then getting them done?
It was. I started to think about that pattern myself and began to really worry. This was something that was certainly becoming part of who I'm all about, I guess. I don't know. So this is an expertise in dealing with crisis management that I never sought to acquire, and would rather go back and never have to do it. So there's no pride in any of this. But I guess the couple of fundamentals that always come through, and this one was no exception, was first and foremost realizing that the initial information you're going to get is likely either incomplete or just dead wrong. And so avoidance of acting impetuously, but at the same time acting decisively on what it is you can confirm is an imperative. And striking that balance is absolutely essential. This is a variant of what we talked about in an earlier point, but it is nonetheless an important one in this case. When this comes up rapidly, you've got to be able to do that. Number two, once you put together the fundamentals of how you're going to respond to something like this, and it was, again, seeing the diaspora that was retreating, fleeing from New Orleans as a consequence of the flooding that had occurred and the heat and everything else. Thousands of people, traversing through Baton Rouge. The only place that had lights on and operational and, could do anything was the Louisiana State University. We had a cogeneration facility on campus that provided most of the power. Everything else was out for about a 250-mile radius. So it gravitated in, and there it was. We had a fundamental, capacity and requirement under the state emergency preparedness provisions to be ready to accommodate something on the order of, if I remember right, 50 to 75 folks from nursing homes or minimally attended, care facility. That in the event of an evacuation, can you put them up at the university? That in turn created the opportunity to scale that up to thousands by, instead of using one portion of a building that you would designate on campus for that purpose, instead closing down the basketball arena, taking up the parquet floor, and putting down 1,000 cots. And we were not at any loss for the sheer volume of medical professionals, is all the hospitals were shut down. So as a result, they all came to LSU with the opportunity to say, this is something we, as an immediate thing we need to treat and deal with. And so thousands upon thousands of folks came through the Pete Maravich Assembly Center, the basketball arena, to be treated. And it was an opportunity just to kind of establish the largest MASH unit you've ever seen in a span of about 48 hours at the most. So it was focusing on that as an objective, saying, what is it we can do that's going to be extreme, value added? That's an important thing to do. But in addition to that, thousands of students coming out of universities that closed down in New Orleans were a week into the semester and wanted, how do I avoid losing the entirety of the semester? And coming onto campus and saying, is there any way I can enroll? Thousands of them. So the answer was, you bet. Everybody that's at any other university, you are immediately enrolled. And let's go figure out how to deal with all that. And to facilitate all that, the most important point, I would say, to make all that work, you can articulate all the goals and objectives, lay them out, but you got to also follow through and empower people to go do it. And so every time there was any kind of a regular daily, many times a day kind of meeting in which we were looking at inventorying what the conditions were at the time, folks would say, well, we're waiting for direction on this. I said, wait a minute. Look in the mirror. You're the direction now, okay? This is your opportunity. You see what's going on here. You're in the best position to respond to it. On that part of the problem you're talking about, you get the authority right now to go fix it and go deal with it in the way you see fit, because you know more about it than anybody else does. Have at it, and you're in charge on that. And that level of empowerment, if you will, is born in part of necessity, but it also is born of an opportunity to really utilize a remarkable capacity you have of people who are the closest to the problem are going to be the ones with the clearest understanding of what the solutions need to be.
Absolutely incredible. A lot of people tend to make decisions based on emotions. And earlier in our show, you mentioned instinct. Trust your gut is something we hear often. As a professor of strategic management, can you make the case for why more people should pursue that discipline and how we can make more of our decisions based on strategy rather than emotion?
It's a very good question. I think it starts with, first and foremost, everybody in the organization understanding what is the purpose of what we do? What is the organization all about? If we weren't here, what would be deficient? What wouldn't be going on? And once you can establish a sense of community, of a purpose, a mission, that everybody can feel like they're all part of that, then the rest flows from that as a bunch of strategic objectives that can be established based on trade-offs and understandings of what's your core competence and where we're going to put your resources and what's the greatest game, what's the cost return that will occur as a result of the value and added from every one of the things you could do. And I think it has to begin though with that sense of everyone feeling like I have a part in something that's bigger than I am. And once I understand that that's where this fits and that I'm integral to that if I don't do my job, it will be less than it needs to be in terms of its quality, effectiveness, utility, whatever. That's a strategic focus that can be established in almost any organization I've ever found, is making sure that people understand that this isn't an option for you not to do what it is you're capable of doing to advance this objective. And if for whatever reason you don't or can't or don't want to, then we really do need to find something else for you to do. And that becomes part of the leadership challenge as well. Is those who are that you need to accomplish the task and who are motivated and empowered to do so can do some remarkable things.
Speaking of trust, as a 4-time presidential appointee, it's clear that presidents trust you. Being able to instill trust among others in you is certainly an important step to self-empowerment in its best sense. What's the best way to go about developing trust?
Well, there are a multitude of different factors, but there's only one that overrides every other. And that is your integrity is the most important thing you have. And once you compromise on that and potentially lose it, that's never restored. And so as a consequence, it's something to be that only each of us have. How we define what our integrity is, how it's derived, it is the greatest strength you bring to any occasion. And from that, if you constantly consult that true north proposition, that's what it's all about, and what you stand for, and what your principles are, what your values are, and they're very clear in your mind. There are folks around you, particularly the leadership that you serve, work for, work with, come to realize this is someone I can at least trust they're doing what they believe is the right way to do this. And to the extent that proves to be deficient, it won't be for lack of commitment to accomplishing that. That takes you a good long way. And it really does. Again, it's not hard to follow through on if you can clearly establish in your mind what are those values, what are those basic fundamentals that then comprise what your integrity is. And again, anytime there's a compromise to that in which you're perceived to have worse of anything, lied about something, from that point forward, good luck ever trying to recover that reputation ever again. And it's astounding the number of people who unfortunately lose that in turn are wondering why that happened to them. It's real basic. I mean, we all have this instinct. We all have the same understanding. But gee, I don't know if I can trust that person. Or yes, I know I can trust that person. And that in turn opens up an opportunity for much greater dialogue thereafter, and as well as responsibility that comes with that, and the opportunities that flow from that as well.
Let's talk about adversity and courage in the face of a tragedy that was very, very painful for you, both emotionally and physically, that many of our listeners might not know about. On August 9th, 2010, you were on a fishing trip in Alaska with friends and one of your sons when the plane you were in crashed. 5 people, including former Alaska U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, were killed. You were badly injured with a broken neck, broken ankle, and internal injuries. Yet your biggest concern in the first half hour, which must have seemed like an eternity, was that your son, Kevin, had been killed. What drives someone to find the strength to go on in those moments?
It was again, a moment that, again, much like so many I've referred to here, this one really is the seminal moment that had probably more of a profound effect on me than almost anything else. My mentor, my friend, the guy who had in so many ways entrusted me in the earliest phases of my career with lots of responsibility, Ted Stevens, did not survive. And it was very clear to me within moments after this happened that was true. And it was just immediate. It was not a prolonged, determination there. But nonetheless, so much of what he stood for and a remarkable man that he was, and what he meant to me was in part focused my attention. The reason it was so much so was he was sitting right next to me. My son was in the co-pilot seat in the front of the aircraft. And it was when I, after a moment, looked up and realized that he was slumped over in the co-pilot seat, that it did then completely disorient everything. The very idea that he had passed was just not something I could deal with, and unfortunately was not able to move his sheer amount of the wreckage that was pinning me down prohibited me from reaching much further than the length of my arm. But after a bit, he gradually, regained consciousness, came to, and realized he'd been knocked out rather than perished in the event. And it was that moment I thought this is a whole different situation. Now we've got to focus on how do you get out of here. How do we dig ourselves out of this and start thinking through all the things that we could do to improve that. But it was a point of complete despair in that time before it was evident that he was alive. And thank God that sorted its way out. There were 4 of us who survived, 2 of us related. The odds on that were about as far afield as anything we could have imagined. And surviving as a position in the co-pilot seat was the farthest thing that, the probabilities were just off the charts of being so low. And yet that was enough to indicate to me we've got a chance to move out of this. Having survived through that, there's a lot more to come and a lot of other problems we have to deal with just to get out of this situation. But at least we were going to be able to do it together, and that emboldened me to think expansively. Let's put it that way.
After all you've done in your career, you've said that your current job as professor at Syracuse is your dream job. As someone who spent 4 years as an undergrad there and have gone through the winters, how can you say that? How so?
No, I went to grad school here at Syracuse. I've been on the faculty here once before between public service opportunities. And so this was, my friends. So yeah, this is your 3rd time back, and we're going to keep doing this till you get it right. So, but this is the school for anyone who aspires to really wanting to engage in public service and do so meaningfully, to manage challenges, work through issues, lead people, and do things down the road. Boy, it was the best preparation I could have ever had. So this was a rare opportunity to actually pay it forward, if you will, in the context of how much I got out of it, to try to even give a very small measure of that same amount, to the best of my ability, to those coming ahead. And it's folks who are always impassioned about public service and the opportunity to really learn the fundamentals of administration, management, and leadership kinds of challenges, and know how to conquer them as best they can. That really does immediately get past the first condition, which is, how do you motivate everybody? No problem. You're already preaching to the converted. So it's an opportunity to really kind of ratchet the dialogue up substantially above that and to delve into much deeper areas. Plus, the idea of being a faculty member, this is one of those, these are rare jobs where you have, a number of things you must do, like show up and be part of it, and absolutely dedicate yourself to it. But beyond that, you get to do the things you really like doing. And for the things you're not as fond of, well, you don't need to put those on your list nearly as much. And you have the discretion to do so. My biggest failing is that there are so many things I find attractive about this that I overload the cart on things that I like to do, and that usually consumes all of my day and then some. So it's a great experience, but most of all, it's the opportunity to really engage with those who are really excited about wanting to make a difference in public service and do it right, and do it in a way that's going to be real value added. And I find that to be just exhilarating to work with folks with that level of commitment.
Well, as I mentioned earlier in the show, it's my beloved alma mater as well. So I appreciate the shameless and gratuitous plug for that. So thank you, Sean.
My pleasure entirely.
Sean O'Keefe, thanks so much for being with us today. Truly appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Chris. This has been a real pleasure. It's always a pleasure to work with you and to spend time with you. And I thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
No, thank you. And thank you for tuning in to Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. Be sure to tell your friends and family that we'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.